and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a different French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm chatting with Forrest Collins, a cocktail expert who's been based in France for 2 decades. Forrest and I are talking about that oh-so-elusive pre-dinner drinks ceremony, or ritual, maybe. Apéro. All right. Hello and welcome to Forrest Collins. Forrest, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do here in France, how long you've been here, and what you do for work and for pleasure, I guess, because we're going to be talking a bit about pleasure on today's episode.
I'm Forrest Collins, and I've been in France for about 20 years, and I'm a cocktail and spirits expert here based in Paris. And I have a blog called 52 Martinis, where I talk about Paris cocktail bars and drinking trends in France. I have a podcast called Paris Cocktail Talk, where I talk about trends and traditions of drinking in France. And I have an iOS app that is a guide to Paris cocktail bars. So in non-COVID times, it's a resource where you can go look up in Paris where you want to go have drinks, etc. I am also I'm the Académie chair for France for the world's 50 best bars. So I manage the voting panel for the voters from France who determine the world's 50 best bars every year. So I think that kind of wraps up my cocktail and spirits credentials there.
Amazing. And, you've been saying this word cocktails a lot. Our word today is this word in French, apéro, which I know after 15 years of living here a little bit about what it means, but I'm sure that you're going to be able to clue us in quite a bit more. So given your experience with spirits and cocktails, can you tell me a little bit about what apéro means? And above all, what makes apéro different from cocktail hour? Because that's the most frequent translation that I hear.
Absolutely. And I think that roughly that's a decent translation, but they feel very different to me. So first of all, for apéro, it's a shortened version of apéritif, which is a drink, which is often bitter, dry, kind of bittersweet. And the idea of an apéritif is to open your appetite. It comes from a Latin word aperire, I think, which also means to open. So the whole basis of the apéritif is let's get ready to eat something after this drink. In France, apéritif now, it's shortened to apéro, and it can refer to either the drink or the whole experience of this moment of having a drink and a small nibble before a meal. So this is something I think it's practiced all over France by all kinds of people. You see it all the time, which is something that's very different from cocktail hour. When I think about cocktail hour in the US, I think most people, in theory, they love the idea of cocktail hour. And it kind of harkens back to this, black and white films, and you see people coming down in their smoking jackets, and they're actually having a cocktail moment, this hour of cocktail drinking before dinner. And it's generally cocktails. It's American style cocktails. It's strong. It's martinis. That's a little bit different from what you see in Paris with the apéro, which are light and, more apéro style drinks. So I think that in the US, most people, don't really practice cocktail hour. Most people don't sit down and have this cocktail before dinner. I have a few friends who really like food and drinks, and they do. They plan a cocktail. They have a little, half hour where they have a cocktail before dinner, and then they go into dinner. But I think in the US, it's pretty rare. People might have cocktail parties. They might go out for cocktails. But I think we've kind of lost that old school tradition of let's get ready for dinner. Let's go have our cocktail. It's a romantic idea, but I don't think it happens as much. On the other hand, you have a lot of happy hour kind of in Anglo countries, but I think that's also a different thing. So cocktail hour, cocktails here where you have apéro, I think it is something that is much more functional in terms of usually drinks that are good to have before a meal, usually things that do open your appetite. And it is a tradition that is practiced all the time, regularly across France, across age groups, across social groups. So, and one other thing about the apéro that I've noticed personally, I don't know if you've noticed this as well, Emily, but I feel like you're never going to have cocktail hour before lunch. But when I go to, my my French in-laws home, or when I go to French friends, we'll have an apéro before lunch. It's the moment, a moment before a meal, where you have a little something to drink, and usually a little snack. Does that kind of answer your question about the difference?
Oh, absolutely. And I have 100% noticed that the lunchtime apéro, and even I remember I have some friends who live in the countryside who said if you ever want to be served apéro, make sure you show up at someone's house at around 11:30 in the morning, and a coffee show up at 4. I mean, yeah, on like a random, I mean, obviously people go to work nowadays, but on like a Sunday at 11:30, if you show up, you're definitely going to be poured a drink and given some little nibbles,
And something
100%.
else I've noticed, and I don't know if this is across the board or just with the people that I've sort of met, but so my in-laws, for example, sometimes they will invite neighbors over just for the apéro, and it's very clear that you're invited over for this drink before lunch, and then you're going to go home and have lunch at your house, and I'm going to stay here and have lunch here. And I've been invited to other French people's homes where I was invited for apéro, and it might turn into dinner, but it's not. I don't know. I might feel rude saying, coming over for a drink. Now off you go. But I've seen it happen here. So, and I think that's kind of a nice way to spend some time with people and have a drink with them, but not feel obliged to, have a whole meal or, I don't know. There seems very French about it. We'll now go our separate ways and eat our own meals.
And of course, the assumption then is that you already planned what you were having for dinner, which I feel is also a very
Oh,
French
yeah.
mindset of like no one's standing vacuously in front of the fridge going, "No, what am I going to make?" It's like, "Oh no, we had a plan." You were talking a little bit about the kinds of drinks that one might have at apéro, and I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about this because in my experience, I've noticed that it can vary a lot. A, based on the region, and B, and I know this is probably not a super popular thing to be noticing these days in the 21st century, but that it varies a lot based on gender. So, like, I've noticed, for example, that a lot of men will drink pastis, that a lot of women will maybe drink a kir. And then you have these sort of regional specialties, like I think where you live, there's the pomo, the sort of combination of the juice and the local alcohol. Can you tell me a little bit about what people might be serving for apéro and if you've noticed these same kinds of
Yeah, I
regional
think you've really
variations?
nailed it with that, with the regional variations. I think, Paris is a mixed bag, so we can talk about that kind of separately. But I think when you're
Mhm.
outside of Paris, all throughout France, they definitely, there's definitely these regional tendencies. I mean, obviously, if you go to Marseille, you've got a really strong tradition of pastis. But yes, here we're right on the border of Normandy, and so there's tons of cider apple trees and Calvados being made. So we have pommeau, which is a mix of the apple juice and Calvados. And if you go down to, for example, around the Cognac area, you've got something similar, which is the Pinot de Charente, which is a wine that's kind of with a little bit of cognac added. So you do have, you've got Suze in certain regions. You've got so many different kind of specialty before dinner drinks. I think in Armagnac, you've got Flacon de Neige, I think it's called, and it's very similar to the Pinot de Charente, except it's with Armagnac. And I think that, in so many of these regions, I think France has a really strong agricultural tradition. And I think that people really value eating and drinking locally and they're proud of their products. So I think that, that's really reflected in the drinks. And yeah, so I think that that's something that happens a lot. I also think that you're right about the differences in the gender. I always, not always, but often, I spend a lot of time in bars and I see women are more likely to have something a little bit more light, a white wine, something sparkling, a Kir Royale, and men, are more likely to have a pastis or a little half thing of beer. For sure, I've noticed some gender differences, and I think that one of the great things about France is not just in terms of these regional tendencies, which are really interesting. France has some great different options when it comes to these aperitif spirits, or aperitif drinks. When I was talking about maybe cocktail hour, which is more of a U.S. or maybe a UK tradition, and those drinks would be kind of strong and almost overpowering for your palate. In France, there's really this tradition to go towards vermouths, whether it's Italian vermouths, sometimes French vermouths, or bitters, things like Suze. We now see a really big trend of the Apéro spritz that's happening in France, which is also a great aperitif drink because it's got this bittersweet quality that makes you salivate, which is exactly what you want in an aperitif, because when you salivate, it doesn't sound very sexy, but it's getting you ready to eat your meal after. So there's just a lot of these really interesting different vermouths, fortified wines, bitters, which are not wine based, but similar, but they're spirit based. And again, things like pastis or gentian based drinks like Suze. So I think that we really are kind of spoiled for choice when it comes to aperitif style drinks. And then, also there's champagne or white wine, which are always great.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors.
While walking the streets of Paris, do curious details ever catch your eye? The city has a myriad of lieux cachés, or hidden places, and we uncover the most intriguing ones on the Paris Cachet podcast. If you're keen to explore Paris on a deeper level, then join Paris Cachet host Lily Heisey and a cast of zany historical figures from queens to angry mobs as we traverse the city and the centuries on our quest to discover the surprising stories behind these lieux cachés. The Paris Cachet podcast is available every other Sunday on Paris Underground Radio. Visit parisundergroundradio.com/Paris Cachet to listen and subscribe.
And now, back to Navigating the French. Well, okay, so the wine question is one that I'm super interested in, and I'm going to reveal myself as someone who is a little bit, or was a little bit, inculte, which is one of my other favorite French words, INCULTE. It kind of means uncultured. And when I first showed up in France, I was 19 years old. And like many students studying abroad, I was, super excited by the fact that A, I could drink, and B, that there was, 3 to 4 euro red wine in the grocery store that was totally drinkable. So I was drinking red wine as my pre-dinner drink. And I remember the first time I went to a French person's house and they asked me, what would I like for apéro? And I don't much care for pastis and I don't much care for whiskey. And so I asked for a glass of wine. And I remember people being really flummoxed by that. Is wine an appropriate apéro? Is red wine ever okay as apéro? What sort of have you noticed with the association between wine, which, is obviously very French, and apéro, which is also very French? Can those two categories meet and when?
Yes, I absolutely think they can, but for me, they meet in the white wine territory or the champagne territory. I think when you're going to maybe, kind of a certain generation, like an older generation, it will be very likely be champagne that you'll get for your apéro. And I think white wine is a great aperitif, especially a dry one, because it does do the same thing that some of these bittersweet aperitif drinks do. It kind of gets your mouth ready to eat. Red wine, I always tell people, do what you like, but I would really, both for, cultural reasons here and for, just palate reasons, advise against red wine, because it's going to kind of overwhelm your palate for anything to come after. And for, in my in-laws' house, we always start with white wine and then we move on to red wine. And I actually, when it comes to wine, I don't really abide by some of the really old traditional rules, like, red with meat and white with fish and never go back to white. But I do think in a just kind of a general meal, you want to start with white and not get those heavy reds in there. But I totally agree with you. I mean, it's lovely that you can go out and get a nicely priced glass of red. And I don't think always when people go out for the apéro, they are approaching it in such a pedantic manner. I'm getting ready for my meal. I want to, lots of times the apéro, when it just refers to people going out and having this moment together after work and before dinner, they're just going out for drinks and little snacks. And so, no aperitif police are going to show up if somebody decides they want red wine. But I do think if you kind of want to do it the quote right way, I would suggest a really dry white wine or champagne.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also really different when you're out and when you're in someone's home, right? Because when you're out, you can order anything that's on the menu. But if you're at home, you're relying on someone else's. To be fair, a lot of French people have a pretty fleshed out bar area, but you're relying on what they have.
I think that's definitely true. And I think, I think sort of a good host or hostess will also kind of guide you. Would you like a glass of white wine? Would you like something else? So I think I've always had options when I've gone into French people's homes, but they're generally starting everybody off with champagne, or they're generally starting everybody off with a particular thing, depending on what region it's in. And which I think kind of lifts a little bit of that pressure, because even though, I've been here for 2 decades, there's still, I'm still kind of going into people's homes. And even if I were going to an American person's home, it's kind of like, okay, what are the rules here? What are the social rules? So I think it's nice when a host kind of guides you through that way, instead of sort of leaving it all open. But yeah, I think that in a French person's home, you'll definitely have a choice of some different, like, the Martini Blanc or the Martini Rouge or whiskey. France is a really big whiskey drinking country. But I'm rambling now. I'm sorry. I think I forgot the question.
You answered the question, and I think you've kind of nudged up against something that I definitely want to talk about, which is the rules of etiquette surrounding apéro, because you were talking about how your hostess is often, or your host is often, going to guide you in choosing your apéro. But I've noticed a couple things as an American where it feels like, the best possible way you can be treated is you get invited to someone's house and they say, make yourself at home.
Yes.
In France, especially apéro, you definitely don't want to go making yourself at home. Are there any sort of etiquette rules that you've noticed around apéro that people should be aware of if they get invited over to someone's home for this pre-dinner drink? I don't know. It's almost like a ceremony.
Exactly. Yes, it is. And I do think, you don't really make yourself at home. I think that, well, my experience has been, and, I've read different things about this, that, everybody's served at the same time. Now, coming from an Anglo background, I am, and I host a lot of things. I always feel mortified if a guest arrives in my house and they don't have something in front of them right away. They don't have a drink, they don't have a glass of champagne. I cannot let a guest sit empty-handed. And, the contrary in France, everybody waits. Everybody waits to be served. Everybody waits till they've got their glass in their hand. Nobody's sipping anything before anyone else. So you go in and you wait for the other guests to arrive and the hostess to serve or make the drinks. And then, everybody does their little cheers, their little santé, or, raising of a glass. And that's how an apéro starts, or pretty much any time I've ever been served drinks in France. You don't jump ahead of anybody else. And when you cheers, there's also the little tradition of you're supposed to look every single person in the eye as you cheers them. I don't know if that's universal or if that's just in France, but yeah, so I think there's that. And I do think I don't serve myself at an apéro, but as a hostess, I do make sure that my guests are served, that their drinks are topped up, that their, wine is topped up or what have you. And of course I invite them too, but in a French person's home, I just wait, because I think, I don't know, but I have the suspicion that, in America, we're all excited to get together and have these drinks. Whereas French people, they could probably sit and have a conversation for 30 minutes without even thinking about the drinks in front of them. Now, I'm not saying that, Anglophones are bigger drinkers or, more interested in alcohol, but I do think that this moment of the apéro, even though I've been talking about it a lot in terms of a drink that opens your appetite and a specific thing to do before a meal. I think in the French culture, it is really a moment to come together. So the drink is important, but almost secondary to the moment of spending time together.
Totally. And that kind of also leads me to another question, which is, does apéro require alcohol?
No, it doesn't. And I think really a lot for the reasons I just explained. And I think because it is something that it really crosses generations. So, children are involved in apéro as well. And, even though children are allowed to drink earlier and probably, even before legal drinking age, can have a sip of this or that at the table. So they've got a little something going on. And I know a lot of French women who just aren't, again, sorry to break it down by gender things, but I see it more often with the French women that I know, they'd rather have, a Diet Coke or something. So again, this comes back to the apéro as being also a tradition of a moment of time to spend together. And something else I've noticed here a lot in the grocery stores, the large grocery stores, is they have a pretty good range of aperitif-style drinks that are non-alcoholic. So they've got a gentian-based drink, I think, a gentian-based, they've got a red vermouth, they've got a white vermouth, they've got sort of a amber vermouth, they have a style of pastis. All of these things are for sale in the grocery store in non-alcoholic versions as well. And I see people buying them. It's not this kind of question of, oh, it's up there and it never goes off the shelf. I see them in people's carts as I go through the grocery store aisles, especially when I'm out here in the countryside. So I think that it doesn't have to have alcohol. I mean, it's, obviously alcohol is nice. It's a nice social lubricant, but I think, I often see people, just enjoying the apéro, with whatever makes them happy, alcoholic or not.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors.
When former college roommates Joanne and Britt join up for a hike in the Colorado Rockies on Joanne's 25th birthday, they're prepared for a light, fun, 4-hour walk culminating in delicious birthday barbecue.
You ready? Britt, are you putting on lipstick?
So what?
So we're about to go on a 4-hour hike up the Rockies.
So? Mother Nature will appreciate the effort. But when they decide to follow a mysterious arrow in the woods, things take a turn for the bizarre. Hey, wait, this rock has an arrow painted on it. Was that yours?
I don't remember an arrow.
Should we follow it? Maybe it's a sign.
We don't want to get lost, though. There's only this one trail.
Well, let's just take a little peek. What could possibly go wrong? With not much more than lipstick, dental floss, and their own senses of humor to get them through, will they survive against Mother Nature, unexplained occurrences, and an abandoned town that may not be abandoned after all? Babes in the Woods, an original comedic mystery series. Wednesdays on Paris Underground Radio.
And now, back to Navigating the French. Yeah, and what you said about kids made me remember, I mean, I've been at apéros before at people's houses who have small children, and they'll literally give their kids, like maybe a glass of juice, or the French are really into these syrups that you can dilute in water, so like grenadine syrup. And then they get their own little bowl of these gâteaux apéro, which you see in every French supermarket, and which we haven't talked that much about yet, but crackers or pretzels or mixed nuts or things like that. And the food, obviously, it's like you said, it's to sort of whet your appetite. So it's not going to be that consequential, except now we have this trend of apéro dînatoire. So can you tell me a little bit about that, sort of what it is and with whom it's popular in France?
Absolutely. I like the trend. And just before I pop over to the apéro dînatoire, I think, yes, an apéro, I talked about it a lot in terms of what we drink, but there is always a little something, a very small something, like you said, like a little, something crunchy. And you even see it, I was eating for the first time on a terrace this weekend, and we sat down, we'd already ordered our food, but our drinks came out with a small thing of pretzels because, you have your drink before and you have a tiny munchie. So apéro pretty much always involves food, but usually a small amount. The apéro dînatoire, on the other hand, is this more expanded version, and it is basically a meal that you can make out of an apéritif, out of an apéro, moment apéro. So it's a lot of food that will be served during your drinks and, over the course of some time. So it's something that I think you see more and more. I see more and more happening, especially when I'm looking at maybe ages kind of mid-30s and under. They're having these apéro dînatoire. They're having parties where they're inviting all their friends and they're having some drinks, and everybody's bringing some things to eat, or the hostess is putting out lots of little things to eat. So I kind of equate it to sort of a small plates dinner, or maybe kind of a cocktail party where you're serving, cocktail, I guess, finger foods. And, ideally it should be enough to fill you up through the night, and really a nice variety of things. And you can basically do as you like. But, I think that most people like to have a really good mix of, vegetables and something with meat. So that might be charcuterie or rillettes or something like that. Crunchy things like pretzels and crisps, kind of briny pickled things, olives, or, some kind of other like pickles or something like that. Sardines. If you get really advanced, you might kind of start out with that and then move on to something that's maybe kind of warm, like, I don't know, gougere out of the oven or little escargot or anything like that, kind of warm toasts. And I think that you see in both the grocery stores and at Picard, which is the frozen food chain that's very, very popular across all of France, that has nice frozen food. They do a lot of these big boxes full of little teeny tiny petit fours or things like this, where, they're little snacks, they're little tiny pastries with different kind of mousse or cheese or tomatoes or things on top, because they're perfect for the apéro dînatoire. The French can just put a bunch of these in the oven, and then voila, they've got these nice little hot snacks they can serve to their guests. So yeah, I think it's a trend that I really have seen taking off. And I think, a lot of this is because even though the French meal is very, very important, and, it's recognized by UNESCO as this sort of gastronomically, culturally important thing, I think that you do see, as people work more, as people get busier, they're moving to sort of easier ways to entertain. I have some French friends, and every Friday, at home, they've worked a long day, a long week, and their dinner is always apéro dînatoire. They put the kids around the coffee table, they throw out the Funyuns and the carrots and the dips and the hummus, and that's it. And it's probably much easier for them to spend a kind of fun family time on a Friday night rather than trying to make a big meal. So I see it, and also it is fun. It's kind of like the small plates trend that we've seen so much for the past decade or more. It's just a little bit more casual and laid back and fun.
Yeah, and I think what you said about Picard made me smile. I think that Americans especially would probably be very surprised to learn how much the French rely on Picard for those little, the petit four, or even for like they have an incredible flourless chocolate cake that you can throw in the oven for 4 minutes and it's done. And it's just, we're not all making our own puff pastry at home over here. We are still looking for
absolutely
easy ways to have a delicious, sort of apéro or meal or dessert. I think a lot of what you've been talking about as we've been talking about apéro has kind of reminded me that what you were saying about cocktails being a little more highbrow perceived in the States, and apéro being this thing that you can do at lunch, at dinner, on a weeknight with your neighbors, with your kids. And then also this fact that we're going to wait for everybody to arrive. So there's this conviviality to it that means that sometimes if you've got a friend who's running late, you might be hanging around at someone's house for 20 minutes without a drink in your hand so that you can all have that moment of the first cheers together. Mm-hmm. That seems to really reflect these sort of like dual French values of like equality and conviviality. Do you think am I going too far with this, or does that feel right to you?
Nope, that does feel right to me. I think I will go a little farther and say, to me, it's always really interesting when I talk to, my guy, he's French. And when I listen to him talk about him in terms of him and his, fellow Frenchies and me, like, I feel like there's a real pride in the similarities. There's a real pride in the equality. There's a real pride in being the same as all other French people. Whereas I feel like Americans are like, there's a real pride in being different than everyone else. So I'm okay having my drink first, as an American, but as a French person, no, we're all going to go into this. We're all going to go into this together. And I think there's something very valid about both of those. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the traditions of the apéro really do reflect a lot of the, French cultural truths about how they want to spend time with each other, about how they feel as French citizens, and about how they appreciate food and drink and the company of family and friends.
Amazing. Forrest, thank you so much for taking the time to chat apéro with me today. I have had so much fun talking and learning even more about this tradition that I think we can all participate in, whether we're in France or not. Before we sign off, I just have one more question for you. Mm-hmm. What is your favorite word in French?
Oh, gosh. Well, I really like coquillage just because I think it's, which is shell. It just sounds so pretty. If I thought about it more, I'd probably come up with something different, but coquillage is one I always appreciate saying.
I do love that word. It's got a nice ring to it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Have a really fantastic rest of your day. And I hope that you get to enjoy a really wonderful apéro at some point today.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk to you as always. And yeah, I think I will make arrangements to have a nice apéro tonight.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to more episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt!